and killed Terrence Crutcher Friday. Dash cam and helicopter video of the incident shows Crutcher walking towards his SUV with his hands in the air right before that shooting. But it is unclear what happens when he reaches the vehicle. Shelby's attorney maintains that Crutcher was not following police commands in the moments before she opened fire. Tulsa County's district attorney says arrangements are being made for Shelby's surrender. If convicted, Shelby could serve 4 years in prison. And tonight, police in Charlotte, North Carolina say Keith Scott, who was shot and killed, refused to drop a gun. Residents, though, insist he was unarmed. And so far, city officials say they won't provide the public with video evidence. Outrage over the police shooting once again turned violent last night in North Carolina. The police chief said 9 people were injured, 44 arrested. Overnight during the protest that turned into riots at times throughout the night with looting as well. And just now coming into Fox, we can confirm that Scott's family was shown that police video of the shooting this afternoon. Correspondent Jonathan Seri is in Charlotte tonight with the very latest. Good evening, Jonathan.
Good evening, Brett. Lawyers would not confirm to reporters or would not comment to reporters on how that viewing went down. But they do tell reporters that Mr. Scott did not own a gun. They say that he was not known to carry a weapon. They also say that his wife witnessed her husband shooting on Tuesday, something they say will remain with her for the rest of her life. But they did not call on police to make that video evidence public.
Our practice has been not to release, but to allow for the party who feels they've been mistreated in any way to see that.
Because state and federal agencies, including the FBI, may be called in to investigate, Charlotte authorities say it would be premature to release their video evidence to the general public. They agreed to honor the Scott family's request to view it. The ACLU and NAACP have both called for the video to be released. Some protesters claim Tuesday's shooting involved a white police officer firing at an unarmed black man. Police say the officer was African American, and evidence they've collected, including video, shows Scott was armed and posed a threat. But at this moment, that's it.
The video does not give me absolute, definitive visual evidence that would confirm that a person is pointing a gun.
I ask again for calm, peaceful demonstrations from our citizens. It is important that we have a full and transparent investigation of the original incident.
For 2 straight nights, protests in Charlotte turned violent. One man seen here in this amateur video was critically injured. Police say he was shot by another civilian. In Washington, the Congressional Black Caucus called on the Justice Department to stop what it calls an epidemic of killings of young African Americans at the hands of local police.
Every case is different, so I'm not going to be able to outline for you what would make us open a full investigation in Charlotte or when that might occur.
Attorney General Loretta Lynch announced the DOJ will be on the ground in Charlotte to offer technical assistance and support to the Charlotte Police Department. Local officials say they do not see the need to impose a curfew at this point, but some businesses in uptown Charlotte, including Bank of America, took the added precaution of advising employees to stay home. Other businesses had no choice. Looters smashed into this uptown Charlotte variety store. After police investigated the scene, officers helped the owners clean up the damage, offering perhaps a glimmer of hope for calmer days ahead.
Keep our citizens safe and to also ensure that our police officers are treated with respect, and also to ensure that there is no further destruction of property, and those who destroy property or hurt other people will be dealt with.
City leaders are calling for peace, but preparing for the possibility of more violence. Meanwhile, the state is sending additional resources to Charlotte, including state troopers and the National Guard, to help protect people and property in the event tonight's demonstrations turn violent. Brett.
Jonathan Seri live in Charlotte. We will be watching that closely, and you'll see it live here in Charlotte. The Washington Post released an assessment of the number of civilians killed by police this year. To date, in 2016, 706 have been killed. That's unfortunately on par with last year's 990. 324 of those killed have been white, 173 black, and 111 were Hispanic. 98 of the victims' races were either unknown or something else. When compared to the full population in the U.S., blacks are 4 times more likely to be killed than whites and twice as likely as Hispanics. On the campaign trail, Donald Trump addressed the police shootings and violence in America today and told Fox News he might bring back a policy that was deemed unconstitutional. Chief political correspondent Carl Cameron has the story from Pennsylvania.
In the battleground state of Pennsylvania's western mining country for the first day of fall, Donald Trump held off energy remarks to first discuss the latest police-involved shooting and ensuing rioting in Charlotte, North Carolina.
Our country looks bad to the world, especially when we are supposed to be the world's leader. How can we lead when we can't even control our own cities?
Trump promised to implement a national anti-crime agenda and wants to activate in places like Chicago a crime-fighting tactic that was halted in New York City.
I would do stop and frisk. I think you have to. We did it in New York. It worked incredibly well, and you have to be proactive.
Boosted in the 90s by then New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani, now an ardent Trump ally and constant campaign companion, Stop, Question, and Frisk was controversial and ultimately deemed unconstitutional by a New York federal judge and ended in 2013. The White House pounced.
It might lead one person to conclude that the politician's more interested in playing politics than finding a solution.
Trump was in Pittsburgh to court blue-collar energy industry voters at the 2016 Shale Insight Conference, where he slammed his rival.
Hillary Clinton's war on energy will cost our economy $5 trillion at least. She's not only declared war on the miners, but on all oil and natural gas production. It's war, which supports 10 million jobs in the United States.
Despite decades of job losses in the nation's increasingly automated coal industry, Trump promised to create jobs and boost the energy sector.
I'm going to lift the restrictions on American energy and allow this wealth to pour into our communities, including right here in the state of Pennsylvania.
Trump's been off the airwaves in the battleground states for at least a week, in some states much longer. He plans to resume TV ads in his four must-win swing states of Florida, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and North Carolina before Monday's first debate against Clinton on Long Island. But otherwise, Trump's only on national cable TV, radio, and the web. Clinton's campaign schedule is much lighter than Trump's, but she's out advertising him 5-1 nationwide. When asked yesterday by an Ohio reporter why he flip-flopped and admitted last week that President Obama was born in the United States, Trump didn't say because it's true, only that it was hurting his campaign.
Well, I just want to get on with, we want to get on with the campaign. And a lot of people were asking me questions.
Carl Cameron with the Trump campaign. Carl, thank you. As Carl mentioned, Hillary Clinton is sitting out. Another one today, choosing not to hold a rally for supporters. Instead, her focus is said to be Monday's first presidential debate. And her staff seems to be working overtime to get a leg up on the competition. Correspondent Jennifer Griffin reports.
While Hillary Clinton stayed off the campaign trail to prepare for Monday's debate, an interview she taped with comedian Zach Galifianakis was posted online.
Do you wonder what your opponent might be wearing? I mean,
I assume he'll wear, that red power tie.
Or maybe like a white power tie.
That's even more appropriate.
With anti-police riots raging in Charlotte, North Carolina, Clinton running mate Tim Kaine weighed in during a campaign speech in Nevada.
There is a need to build better bridges between law enforcement and the communities they serve. Hillary and I understand that.
A day earlier, Clinton tried to rally a union workers' convention by video link.
Why aren't I 50 points ahead, you might ask?
An answer may be found in a new NBC Wall Street Journal poll that shows Trump leading Clinton 41 to 31% in terms of trustworthiness. The campaign attempted to address that shortcoming in a new radio ad with First Lady Michelle Obama.
It's the highest stakes, hardest job you can imagine. That's why I trust Hillary.
Today, the Clinton campaign updated sent estate tax. Overall, the Clinton plan increases taxes by $1.5 trillion over the next decade, according to the Nonpartisan Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. Her new plan would raise taxes on estates valued at over $10 million. The new top rate of 65% would only apply to a few hundred households. The campaign told Fox News it would have to first pass a Republican Congress.
The campaign is hoping she'll be asked about more than just her emails on Monday night, Brett.
Jennifer Griffin with the Clinton campaign. Jennifer, thank you. Another week, another batch of personal emails revealed to the world after a hacking. The same group responsible for hacking into former Secretary of State Colin Powell's emails has now gotten into a White House contractor's computer, revealing a lot about the First Lady's and the Vice President's schedules, as well as other details. Correspondent Kevin Cork is at the White House tonight with this story. Good evening, Kevin.
And good evening to you, Brett. Obviously, Fox News has not been able to verify the veracity of these emails, but administration officials tell us they are looking into the matter, and they're obviously taking it very, very seriously. Now, we have noticed that the documents don't really have the sort of salacious details that we saw from, say, former Secretary of State Colin Powell's account. But these emails do deal with scheduling, both for the First Lady and the Vice President, and that in and of itself is a major security issue. Maybe the biggest headline of all, though, from this latest trove is the posting of what appears to be a copy of the First Lady's passport. Again, that's not been verified. White House Press Secretary Josh Earnest is calling it a big wake-up call for all of us.
And it's important for all of us to be conscious of protecting our information and practicing good cyber hygiene. And that certainly is something that we've seen from, that's certainly something that we were reminded of in the context of reports about former Secretary of State Colin Powell and the cyber breach that he was a victim of.
Okay, now, the group that's responsible for this leak is that DC Leaks group that you and I have talked about previously, Brett, and it's believed by intelligence officials they're a Russian hacking operation. And that's a major concern, not just for the White House, but for the administration at large, because they're also believed to be attempting to influence the 2016 presidential campaign. The group is also said to have breached Democratic Party organization systems and at least 2 state election systems. And maybe an even better question is, when you consider this, Brett, there are a number of low-level administration folks, many of them are contractors and freelancers, that have access to critical information like scheduling. And it does beg the question, why? Meanwhile, the administration continues to remind staffers, don't use your private email when it comes to government business, Brett.
Kevin Cork, live on the North Lawn. Kevin, thank you. The FBI is investigating a massive breach of Yahoo accounts. Yahoo said today hackers stole the personal information from 500 million accounts. 500 million. The stolen data includes users' names, email addresses, telephone numbers, and dates of birth. Yahoo blamed the hack on a, quote, state-sponsored actor. The company recommends users change their passwords if they haven't done so since 2014. ICE was on the hot seat today, specifically the head of Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, who sometimes struggled to answer lawmakers' questions about an immigration system that was often depicted today as broken. Chief Washington correspondent James Rosen has the story.
A former U.S. attorney in Texas, now the head of U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, Sarah Saldana, told the House Judiciary Committee she approaches her job as a former federal prosecutor. Yet even that posture exposed the top immigration official to tough questioning.
As a former prosecutor, I'm just wondering how you can continue to square the existence of sanctuary cities with the duty of a prosecutor to ensure justice.
These cities that you're talking about, sir, have their own laws. Either the state passes them or there's a local ordinance over which I have no control. All I can do is to use my best persuasive powers to work with them.
Saldana testified 2 days after auditors at the Department of Homeland Security reported that citizenship was improperly granted by a separate agency, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, or CIS, to some 1,800 illegal aliens who had already received final deportation orders but used false ID and benefited from inadequate archiving of fingerprint records.
The Inspector General has provided 2 recommendations: that ICE finish uploading into the digital repository the fingerprints it identified, and that DHS resolve these cases of naturalized citizens who may have been ineligible. Are you in the process of doing that?
Yes.
And my understanding is that the Inspector General is satisfied that you are doing that. Is that correct?
Yes.
Committee Chairman Bob Goodlatte, Republican of Virginia, pressed Saldana on still another audit conducted last year by the Government Accountability Office, which found immigration judges have granted asylum to some 3,700 aliens whose asylum claims were prepared by others convicted of immigration fraud.
None of those cases have been reopened according to the Department of Justice. What action have you taken to investigate these cases?
We will obviously focus on these 3,000 in particular.
What action have you taken to investigate those cases?
In those cases that we've reviewed, we have opened matters in order to take a look at them and see the facts and circumstances of each case.
Finally, a document shared exclusively with our colleagues at FoxNews.com by Republican Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin, chair of the Homeland Security Committee, shows officials at U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services urging coworkers there to work overtime to swear in as many new citizens as possible, quote, due to the election year. A DHS spokesman did not immediately respond to requests for comment. Brett.
We will definitely follow up on that. James, thank you.
You bet.
Lawmakers are calling for a perjury investigation for a former Veterans Affairs executive after the VA's internal watchdog found the construction of a new VA hospital is more than $1 billion over budget. The scathing new report released Wednesday found gross mismanagement, delays, and lax oversight by the VA in the construction of the Denver area VA hospital. It found that former senior VA official Glenn Hagstrom knew the project was heading toward huge cost overruns, but didn't tell lawmakers when he testified before Congress. Hagstrom retired in 2015. The hospital is now expected to cost nearly $1.7 billion, nearly triple the 2014 estimate. Up next, more U.S. troops may be headed to ground operations in Iraq. We'll explain. First, here's what some of our Fox affiliates around the country are covering tonight. Fox 5 in New York. Our former top aide to Democratic Governor Andrew Cuomo was among 8 people charged today in a bribery and fraud case. According to the complaint, Joseph Percoco took more than $315,000 in bribes from an energy company to build a power plant. Governor Cuomo said today he would be extremely disappointed if the allegations proved true. Fox 13 in Tampa, where 2 St. Petersburg city directors have been placed on unpaid leave while a review is conducted over the dumping of wastewater into Tampa Bay. The Florida Department of Health and Governor Rick Scott began an inquiry into the dumping after Hurricane Hermine. So far, St. Petersburg said water samples taken the day after the hurricane showed satisfactory results. And this is a live look at Chicago from our affiliate Fox 32. The big story there tonight is Chicago Mayor Rahm Emanuel's plans to cut down on crime in the Windy City. Emanuel's agenda is expected to include more support and mentorship of youth. This follows plans to add nearly 1,000 new police officers, expanding the use of body cameras and mandatory de-escalation training for all officers. Chicago, as we've reported, has recorded more than 500 homicides so far this year, higher than all of 2015. That's tonight's live look outside the Beltway from Special Report. We'll be right back. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad is placing blame tonight on the U.S. for a failed ceasefire deal with Russia. In an Associated Press interview, Assad also said the U.S. airstrikes that mistakenly killed Syrian troops were, quote, definitely intentional, and rejected accusations that Syria or Russian planes struck a humanitarian aid convoy. More U.S. military troops may soon be heading to Iraq, a slow but deliberate buildup of U.S. troops on the ground there in recent weeks. Fox News has learned that officials are asking for several hundred more troops to help in the fight against ISIS. This as we get new details about that chemical attack at a U.S. base in Iraq we first told you about last night. Pentagon producer Lucas Tomlinson reports from the Pentagon.
The U.S. military is seeking an additional 500 troops in preparation for an Iraqi-led ground offensive in Mosul, expected to launch in the next few weeks. This says American troops already in Iraq are finding themselves in more danger. The U.S. military's top officer confirmed a chemical agent was used against U.S. forces, 1,000 American troops on the ground soon. After defeating ISIS in Fallujah and Ramadi, Iraq's elite counterterrorism force will lead the Mosul assault, backed by U.S. air power. Over a year ago, the defense secretary questioned the Iraqis' will to fight. Today, he says challenges remain.
Working with the Iraqi forces, which can be frustrating, but is the only way to do it because it's the only way to make victory stick.
A top Kurdish general says ISIS fighters plan to fight to the death in Mosul. A senior official here says they might not have a choice because the city is surrounded. Brett?
Lucas Tomlinson at the Pentagon. Lucas, thank you. Iran's president addressed the United Nations today for the first time since the U.S.-Iran nuclear deal. And he spent a portion of his speech hurling accusations at the United States over that very agreement. Correspondent David Lee Miller has the story tonight from New York.
Iranian President Hassan Rouhani, speaking before the General Assembly, warned the United States must fulfill its obligations under an agreement to restrict Tehran's nuclear program in exchange for halting international sanctions. This is the first time Rouhani addressed the UN since Iran and 6 other world powers, including the U.S., implemented the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA.
Any failure in implementing the JCPOA will further erode the credibility of the United States.
Rouhani accused Congress of caving into what he called Zionist pressure groups. He also criticized the U.S. Supreme Court for allowing U.S. victims of Iranian terror to collect billions in frozen Iranian assets. He did not mention the $1.7 billion the U.S. recently paid to Iran that coincided with the release of 5 Americans held captive by Tehran. The Obama administration said the payments were confiscated Iranian money owed to the regime. Critics called it a ransom payment. U.S. Joint Chiefs Chairman General Joseph Dunford, answering questions from members of the Senate Armed Services Committee today, took issue with Iran getting its money back.
It certainly is troubling. The more funds that they have available, obviously, the more effective they'll be in spreading malign influence.
Speaking from the same podium on Tuesday, President Obama also praised the deal.
When Iran agrees to accept constraints on its nuclear program, that enhances global security and enhances Iran's ability to work with other nations.
In an afternoon news conference, the Iranian president urged U.S. companies to do business in Iran. Yesterday, the U.S. approved airplane purchases totaling $19 billion from Airbus and Boeing. Brett?
David Lee, thank you. We're learning tonight that at least 50 different intelligence reports were drafted about the documents recovered from Osama bin Laden's compound. And those reports, we're told, have been completed for years. Critics charge that the Obama administration has blocked the report's release because they conflict with the administration's public claims that al-Qaeda is decimated and that bin Laden was isolated and weak. Chief Intelligence Correspondent Catherine Harridge joins us with this Fox News exclusive. Good evening, Catherine.
Well, thank you, Brett. The Republican chairman of the House Intelligence Committee says he's prepared to take what may be unprecedented action to get the remaining bin Laden documents from the nation's top military and intelligence officials.
If they don't provide these documents to the committee by October 11th, then we're going to have to subpoena them, which I don't want to have to do, but it appears like we've run out of all options. For the administration to basically mislead the American people for this many years is flat out wrong.
In the letter to the Director of National Intelligence, the CIA Director, and the Defense Department Undersecretary for Intelligence, Congressman Nunes says the law required them to comply nearly 2 years ago. During the 2011 raid, Navy SEALs recovered enough intelligence to fill a small college library, but only a fraction is public. While the administration characterized bin Laden as isolated with a terror network in disarray, subsequent reviews by the CIA military analysts at CENTCOM in Florida apparently suggest the al-Qaeda leader was deeply engaged with a plan to globalize his network. The White House spokesman today refuted criticism. The documents are being slow-rolled because of conflicting narratives.
No, because that's not the criteria that's being used to evaluate the release of this information. Again, I guess you just have to ask the ODNI for an update on the status of that declassification effort.
A spokesman for the Director of National Intelligence said they would respond directly to that House committee, Brett.
We will follow it. Catherine, thank you.
You're welcome.
A good day on Wall Street today. The Dow jumped 99. The S&P 500 was up 14. The NASDAQ grew 44. A showdown between the administration and Congress over a bill that allows families of 9/11 victims to sue Saudi Arabia. After the break, we'll talk to people on both sides of this issue, fair and balanced. The clock is ticking on the president's plan to veto a bill allowing families of 9/11 victims to sue the government of Saudi Arabia for possibly supporting a terrorist act on U.S. soil. The veto, expected sometime tomorrow, could set up a showdown between the White House and Congress over the Justice Against Sponsors of Terrorism Act, or JASTA. The legislation has even pitted President Obama against some members of his own party.
Were another country to behave reciprocally towards the United States, that could be a problem for some of our service members. That is, I'm told, something that we in the Department of Defense should be concerned about.
I've worked with these families for a very long time, and I think they should have their day in court.
Lawmakers have signaled they will vote to override the president's expected veto before heading home. For more on how the 9/11 victims and families feel about the possibility of a veto, we turn to former White House counsel Jack Quinn, who is one of the attorneys representing the families. Good evening, Jack.
Good evening.
Well, what about this pushback? It's really hard from a lot of both sides of the aisle. Former national security officials saying this jeopardizes U.S. national security abroad.
It's absolutely untrue. It is absolutely untrue. JASTA is an incredibly narrowly tailored statute that actually has nothing whatsoever to do with the liability of individuals, be they diplomats, service people, or any other employees of the government. JASTA has only to do with foreign governments, not individuals.
This suggests, the letter from these former national security officials, including one we'll talk to in just a minute, suggests that it undercuts sovereign immunity protection, from which the United States and all sovereign nations have lived under for centuries.
Also false. Completely false. JASTA is built on a rich history in the area of sovereign immunity. Sovereign immunity in modern times is not an absolute. The world, states across the globe have important exceptions to sovereign immunity. The common exception that applies here is the so-called tort exception, which makes a government subject to the jurisdiction of another country if that government is complicit in causing death, injury, or property damage in that country. That is not an uncommon thing. In fact, in the administration that the judge served in, the Bush administration, not only was the law of this country characterized as allowing, as recognizing the tort exception, which it does statutorily, but indeed the Bush administration went into court and said that that exception would apply to terrorist actions like 9/11.
You're a Democrat.
I am.
What do you think about the president of your party, President Obama, vetoing this bill? And what are the 9/11 families saying about this back and forth?
Well, the 9/11 families are incredibly distressed that he would veto this. And by the way, all of these arguments put forth by the judge and his colleagues, put forth by the administration, put forth by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, these are arguments that have been put out there for 6.5 years. This bill did not come on the scene a month ago. This has been working its way through the Congress for almost 7 years. It has been passed by the United States Senate unanimously twice, reported out of the Judiciary Committee unanimously in the Senate 3 times. It enjoyed unanimous support in the United States Senate. It enjoyed unanimous support in the United States House of Representatives. These arguments were taken into account, and in fact, the statute as a result of these arguments was very carefully tailored. It does not apply to military operations. It makes a very careful distinction between acts of war and acts of terrorism. And let me make this point. The conflation, the confusion that the judge and his colleagues in the administration make between what the United States does to prevent terrorism and what other countries do to support terrorism is a very dangerous proposition.
And you're confident the veto will be overridden?
I am absolutely confident it will be overridden overwhelmingly.
Jack Quinn, thank you very much. Now for the other side, we turn to the judge. Jack was referencing Judge Michael Mukasey. He's former U.S. Attorney General in the George W. Bush administration. Joins us live from New York. Judge, you've been listening to Jack. Your response?
Well, let's start with the fact, with the claim that we're conflating what we do with what terrorists do. I think that's not the issue. The issue is whether foreign governments would conflate what we do with what terrorists do, and they've already shown that they're inclined to do that. Governments as diverse as Belgium, Spain, Afghanistan have tried to bring lawsuits against us and against our diplomatic and military people based on sovereign acts that the United States took. Look, the United States has more people overseas than any other country in the world. More diplomats, more military people, more intelligence gatherers. And we have the most at risk from the notion not that another country is going to do the same thing as was done in this bill, but rather that they're going to use this as the excuse to undercut sovereign immunity and go after not only us, that is as a government, but our diplomats, our military people, and our intelligence gatherers.
Judge, respond to the criticism from 9/11 families and others who support this bill that this is only designed to really protect Saudi Arabia, that this is about the relationship between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia and preventing embarrassment for what may have been funding for the 9/11 attacks.
No, this is about an attempt to essentially extort a settlement out of Saudi Arabia. These people want to get into court based not on a determination by our government that there is a possibility that Saudi Arabia was involved here, because there's been no such determination.
Well, you know the back and forth of the 28 pages that recently became declassified, but there's large sections of it that are still blacked out. Largely pointing to some kind of connection with someone in Saudi Arabia tying to the 9/11 terrorists.
I dispute that there are large sections blacked out. I've read the 28 pages to the extent they've been released. And what they show is contact between people involved in 9/11 and some low-level diplomats in the United States. That doesn't show Saudi government involvement. There's a huge difference between saying that these people had contact with diplomats here of an undisclosed kind and saying that the Saudi government was involved. There's not a shred of evidence pointing to that. And if there were, then there was already legislation that exists that allows our government to make a determination that Saudi Arabia was involved in an act of international terrorism, as we have in the case of Iran.
All right, now
and
quickly,
to allow people to sue.
For some lawmaker who's getting ready to override the president's veto, and it looks like, Judge, they have the votes, both sides of the aisle. You have House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi supporting this and others. What do you tell them in the final pitch that somehow gets them to change their override of this veto?
What I tell them in the final pitch is that we all have sympathy for the 9/11 families. We all want to see them get whatever is coming to them, and perhaps a bit more. But we also want to make sure that the United States is protected, that we don't hurt ourselves in an effort to try to help the families. And in fact, this isn't going to help the families so much as it's going to help lawyers like Mr. Quinn and other trial lawyers who have been pushing for this legislation for years. This legislation went through the Senate. He made it sound as if it received intense consideration. It didn't. There were no hearings in the Senate, and there was a one morning hearing in the House.
But it was 7 years. I mean, and it did come out of committee.
It had no hearings this time around.
Well, Judge, we appreciate your time. Fair and balanced discussion tonight. Jack Quinn, thank you. Next up, the All-Star panel joins me to talk politics. Charlotte. We'll get Judge Napolitano's thoughts on this 9/11 bill as well after a quick break. Before we turn to politics with our panel, let's talk about the discussion we just had about that 9/11 bill. We're joined with our panel, Fox News senior judicial analyst Judge Andrew Napolitano, Heidi Priesbala, senior political reporter for USA Today, Brian York, chief political correspondent of Washington Examiner, and Jason Riley, columnist with the Wall Street Journal. All right, Judge, you heard the back and forth with the judge and Jack Quinn. Your thoughts?
One of the most basic principles of due process in America throughout all of our history is where there's a wrong, there's a remedy. This statute provides the remedy. The courts should not be blocked from hearing these cases. The people who lost loved ones should have every opportunity through Jack Quinn and his investigative team to prove the source and the cause of that loss and to seek compensation.
Sovereign immunity questions and national security concerns aside.
Yes, this does not affect sovereign immunity except for this narrow area. Judge McKasey is right. There may be a reaction on the other side. We have to balance that. But in my view, on balance, the 9/11 families have every right to point a finger at the people in Saudi Arabia who mysteriously have been protected by two administrations.
Well, a big part of the problem here is the backlash. We start making exceptions. Other countries are going to start making exceptions too, and that's the problem. I think the sovereign immunity doctrine is a good one. I think it serves our interests. We want foreign investment in this country. We'll get less of it if we start making exceptions like this, and I don't think that's good. I don't think it's good for U.S. companies that have assets abroad. We don't want to start down this road.
Is this the equivalent of a national security Brexit vote?
Oh, I don't know about that. I think this is election year politicking, on sounding tough on terrorism in an election year.
Speaking of election years, take a listen to today.
Our country looks bad to the world, especially when we are supposed to be the world's leader. How can we lead when we can't even control our own cities?
This is the latest average of recent polls. First, you have the index, special report index of polls. There are 5 polls included here, and that's where it stands right now. Clinton up 2.8. As you look at the NBC Wall Street Journal poll, one of the interesting things are the questions, the candidate qualities. Honest and straightforward, as I mentioned yesterday, upside down for Hillary Clinton. There you see right temperament, knowledge, and experience. Heidi, what about this, the recent violence, the riots or protests, whatever you want to call them, and how they play politically now?
Well, the one thing I was struck by was that there actually was a sliver of unanimity between these two candidates and their responses, and that there seems to be agreement when it comes to the Tulsa shooting, that there are black men who are being shot under questionable circumstances. And on the other hand, we also are seeing an erosion in respect for our institutions and our police force. So where we diverge is in terms of the remedies. And I do think that it's pretty clear that Hillary Clinton is going to be pushing a wholesale overhaul in terms of the criminal justice system, in terms of policing, good police practices. And Donald Trump is focusing more on a law and order message. I think both of them have some big questions that they have to answer in terms of Donald Trump. Is he going to pony up the money for a massive increase in the number of police that we put out onto their streets? And is he also going to embrace the same types of reforms that we saw that we know work, like in New York City, like Bill Bratton did? And for Hillary Clinton, is she just going to focus on better practices, or is she also going to allow that type of a buildup that we know we need in some of these targeted areas like Chicago?
Buildup that happened under her husband's administration, Byron.
Well, when you have the combination of a couple of different types of events, you have terrorist events, New York, New Jersey, Minnesota, and then you have an outbreak of violence in Charlotte. This is a perfect atmosphere for Trump's law and order message. The last time he pushed this the most was after the murder of 5 policemen in Dallas, just right before the Republican convention. But Trump actually seems to be trying to temper this a little bit. He's in Pittsburgh today giving an energy speech. He takes a few minutes to talk about this. He said, we need to be careful to try to walk in others' shoes, to try to see things from their perspective. And like Heidi said, he is trying to draw a distinction between Charlotte, where the police chief is saying, look, this guy had a gun and this was justified, and Oklahoma, where we've just seen the officer actually charged with felony manslaughter. Trump is trying to actually put a little nuance into this position.
Yeah, let me just say, Jason, we obviously the violence is horrible, and all kinds of officials have weighed in on this. We're looking through a prism of politics, and as you look at the latest Fox News poll from North Carolina, actually, on the question of vote preferences, you see black African Americans in North Carolina overwhelmingly, 85% to 3%. For Hillary Clinton, and you see the breakdown there that matches other states. Does this matter in a key swing state like North Carolina?
Yes, it matters, particularly with the percentage of black voters that are in a state like North Carolina. I think these are the states, particularly older voters in these states, that powered Hillary Clinton past Bernie Sanders in the primaries. I think she's having more difficulty with other segments of the black community, however, particularly younger blacks. Millennials who are more open to these third-party candidates, Jill Stein, Gary Johnson, they see them as they don't trust the establishment. They don't mind going with these sort of outsiders. So she's having trouble with that group. But I think absolutely this will impact the black vote. But I would say, yes, this does play to Donald Trump's law and order themes, without a question. But as you mentioned, these are two seemingly different incidents. But what's striking to me about this is how quickly any victim, a black victim of police violence, gets turned into a martyr instantaneously. It doesn't matter if you're armed, unarmed, running from cops, running towards cops. It just doesn't matter. The left, the Black Lives Matter movement, the progressives are going to make you a saint instantaneously. This is very, very dangerous. They are trying to shoehorn any incident into this narrative that cops are hunting black men.
Judge.
And I don't buy it.
The President of the United States actually has very, very little influence on policing in the streets. Yes, they can spend money, and yes, they can give block grants. It takes a long time for the money to be appropriated, for the money to be spent, and for there to be a result from the expenditure of that money. On the other hand, I think they're each attempting to address their particular narrative, and I agree with the arguments that Jason has just made. And I don't blame Hillary Clinton for taking the side that she is taking. She thinks she's going to get votes there. I don't blame Donald Trump for taking the side that he's taking. Neither of them is putting their arms around the country and trying to unite us. Neither of them is looking for a solution. They're both looking for votes. I wish in North Carolina there were the level of transparency that we saw in Tulsa so that people can form their own conclusions, but they have a statute that permits them to hide this tape.
Heidi, quickly, Hillary Clinton off the trail today. There was a video from Funny or Die with Zach Galifianakis that she actually taped on September 9th, the day that she was diagnosed with pneumonia, we're told. Ahead of this debate, where does it stand? Who is the expectations game
well, I think
playing
they're
to?
Both playing the expectations game. If you can see, they're both putting out the word through the media. Donald Trump saying they're going to be overly hard on me, and Hillary Clinton saying the bar is so low for him. And so I think, you know, that for her, I think that the bigger question, the bigger variable is Donald Trump, because we know Hillary Clinton is an experienced debater. We know she loves policy details, and so I do think that there's a certain amount of legitimacy to ask the question is, you know, whether Donald Trump is going to pass this does he look presidential test. And if he does, then, you know, he's got these independent voters which have been coming over to him. He might see some of those numbers solidify, and that's why it's important.
I got to run. We're going to have a couple days to talk about pre-debate, I promise. Next up, a giraffe gets a little too close for comfort. We'll explain. Finally tonight, a giraffe and live morning TV.
Saturday, Nichelle and Dan, you know it's a popular party.